Good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Responsibly. And today we are trying the first version of a morning coffee. And I hope you have your coffee ready. I have mine, or whatever liquid gets you started in the day. The whole concept of what we're trying to do here is that we want to make a very informal way of basically sharing the insights that we're getting at Responsibly as we work with sustainability in the supply chain day to day. It's not supposed to be a very big formal webinar thing. It's just supposed to be a channel where we can share our learnings and we can provide a direct communication channel to you guys. So I'll go through today CSRD and what it means for the value chain, because we've done some research on that specifically. So this is really good if you either sit in procurement or supply chain and wondering how CSRD is going to be impacting whatever sustainability reporting you need to do. And of course, it's also good if you sit in sustainability and you're wondering what implications it's going to have on your value chain specifically. So that's what we'll focus on today. And I'll go through a few slides. You'll see one of my colleagues, Mike, he just wrote a test comment here, and I see comments coming in. So, it's really supposed to be informal, ask questions as we go along, and I'll try to do my best to answer it. And that's really it. Let's try to give this a shot and see how it goes. Wait, there we go. Okay, so CSRD in the value chain. Just before we do that, what is the CSRD? The CSRD is called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It's a new piece of legislation coming out in the EU that's forcing or increasing the sustainability reporting requirements for a lot of companies out there. So it's sustainability reporting. It's not targeted necessarily at the value chain like the upcoming CSRD will be, or the German Supply Chain Act, for example, is. But it has major implications for the actions that you guys take on the value chain, because you will need to report on it as part of the CSRD. It is a very heavy piece of regulation. There are thousands of pages that you can read if you want to, that we've read to understand how we address this in Responsibly, our product specifically. And we'll today pull out the insights from these. We can share this overview with you afterwards. Just send me a direct message and we'll share the slides that we're presenting today. And this is basically the overview of all of the documents with the different links for the individual documents. The most important one is that EFRAG, one of the guiding bodies, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, has issued guidance on the value chain specifically. So that's where you're going to be finding the majority of the information. But then, of course, as soon as you get into the nuances, you need to open up a lot of the other documents. So they also launched a big spreadsheet where they basically write down the 1,000 different KPIs that you should be disclosing as part of the CSRD. There are some documentation on how you do materiality analysis, which you'll see is a major part of the CSRD. And so on and so forth. And then for every single standard, so that would be something like climate, for example, you will have a deep dive document where you can read more about that standard specifically. So a lot of documents. It's also still in a draft stage, so you'll see updates coming out here and there. And we'll probably see some minor iterations coming out. What we're also lacking is sector-specific guidance from the CSRD, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, because they are referring to more general guidance like the GRI and others while they issue their own sector-specific guidance. So that's kind of the overview of all of the stuff you can read. Hopefully, we can just help you get the overview and understand what is this actually about for the supply chain, so you don't need to read everything yourself. This is, of course, not legal advice, right? I have to say that. So, you do need to contract legal advice to kind of cover yourself. But this should be the overview of what it's all about. So it's a little bit of an alphabet jungle out there. We talk about the CSRD because that's the legal framework, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It's issued by the EU. You'll hear things like the ESRS being discussed. That's pretty much the same. That's the reporting standard, the European Sustainability Reporting Standard. and it's being interpreted by the individual member states, and it's being kind of created by EFRAG, EFRAG. So, there's a lot of alphabets out there, but it's all basically referring to the CSRD. The way that this thing works is that they've created topic-specific standards. So that's what you saw on the previous slide, all of these kind of topic-specific documents here. So there's a standard document for every one of the topics. So that would be something like pollution, for example. And then every one of those standards is broken down into disclosure requirements, policies you need to have in place, and these kind of things. And that's basically what we've been analyzing at Responsibly. Okay, and this is the beast. This is basically the overview of what you need to think about when it comes to value chain sustainability and the CSRD specifically. So it's a very kind of complicated slide. It's a little bit difficult to present, but we'll stay on here for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and I'll just go through each of them to give you guys an overview, and then we'll deep dive on it afterwards. Essentially, there's a lot of guidelines that apply to all companies affected by the CSRD, and of course, there are some requirements of when you are big enough to have to report according to the CSRD. But essentially, all companies that fall under those size requirements needs to do what's on the right-hand side of that slide. And then there's going to be some specific guidelines or company-specific things that you need to do. And those are either going to be a result of your materiality analysis of finding issues and topics, and then you need to do something specifically for you. And it's going to be a result of the sector-specific guidelines that CSRD is going to be issuing as well. We'll have a very, very quick look at IFRS and their sector-specific guidelines just at the end of this session, because those are the ones that are most developed by now. And CSRD basically refers to IFRS or GRI until they issue their own guidelines. GRI is still also in development, right? So you only have a few standards out there, while IFRS is pretty complete. Anyways, the first thing you need to do, one of the kind of the cornerstones of the CSRD, is something called materiality assessment. Materiality assessment is a big topic when we talk about sustainability, and it is for the reason that sustainability can mean a lot of different things. So, with sustainability and, with all of those different standard names up there, like pollution and so on, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? We're talking about anything from, child labor to emissions calculations to pollution, a lot of different topics, and we'll give you an overview in a few slides. And materiality assessment is something that you do in the sustainability industry to find out what's relevant for you and for your company specifically. So the whole CSRD is really rooted in companies conducting this materiality assessment. They call it double materiality because there's both an angle that's from an impact perspective, and there's an angle that's from a financial risk perspective. So that's kind of the double materiality is of it. But you basically need to conduct whatever or analyze and have processes around whatever gets uncovered by that analysis. So materiality assessment is about understanding what's relevant to me as a company. The CSRD goes quite deep on how you need to do that or how you could do that, because a lot of this is guidelines, of course. So it's a lot of it is suggestions. The most classic way that is typically being done, that is also being suggested by other pieces of regulation, like the German Supply Chain Act, is what we call a contextual materiality analysis. So that's basically looking at the sectors and geographies of your suppliers. Remember, we're talking about the supply chain today, to understand what's material with them. So if you're buying from, let's say companies in China, you're going to have some topics that are material that won't be material if you're buying from companies in Germany. And the same if you're buying chemicals, then you're going to have some topics that are material, whereas if you're buying professional services, other topics are going to be material. So in my opinion, that's really kind of, that's the big one, right? Once you've done kind of your contextual materiality analysis, you have a pretty good feeling for what you need to understand and analyze where. The CSRD also specifies that you can go deep into due diligence on those suppliers as part of the materiality analysis. So that's something that's a little bit different from the way that the German Supply Chain Act phrases it, for example, where that's all about kind of overall risk analysis and then due diligence afterwards. Here in the CSRD, they kind of include some of those due diligence topics in the materiality assessment, basically saying, hey, if you find hotspots, where things might be occurring based on industry and geographies, then you might want to go deeper and actually reach out and engage that supplier. Now, if you have followed Responsibly in the past, you'll know that there are really two ways you can do supplier due diligence. One is by engaging the supplier. That requires a lot of effort on your suppliers specifically. And the other one is by basically analyzing the supplier's activities pre-engagement. So that could be things like, do they have the right policies in place? Are they disclosing those on their website? Do they have, are they certified within those different topics? Have they been audited? But also, have you done your due diligence and checked that this supplier hasn't been involved in scandals, for example? Have there been investigative journalists that came out and say, hey, actually this supplier has been related to deforestation in the past? Have there been lawsuits and these kind of things? So, there's a lot of ways you can do due diligence. Part of it is basically finding out, did positive things happen that's gonna say, hey, there might be a materiality here based on the geography, but they've been audited, so we are all good on that front. But also, have you done your due diligence and checked that nothing negative has occurred and this supplier is known for basically violating the supply chain specifically? And then there's the supply engagement piece. Now, supply engagement is really, really tricky. I think what we saw with the German Supply Chain Act is that the government quickly came out afterwards saying, hey, we don't want you to start spamming your suppliers with a lot of requests. We're going to see the same thing happen in the EU, I believe, both with the CSRD and the CSRD. So we just need to be super conscious of when we engage the supplier on what. And of course, the more analysis you can do without engaging that supplier, the better. So that's materiality assessment, right? It's about using a bunch of different methods to find out, what's going on in your supply chain, which of these ESG topics should you be paying attention to, where's the hotspot, what should you do about it, basically. The second thing that they will ask you for CSRD is simply to describe your supply chain. So let's say you are, you are a clothes manufacturer. You are producing a bunch of, you're producing clothes. You're procuring a bunch of different materials like cotton. CSRD wants you to describe your supply chain. So basically, how does that cotton supply chain look like? Who are you buying from? Are you buying directly from the farmers? Are you buying from middlemen? And these kind of things. And this goes together with, of course, when we need to analyze the supply chain, you have your tier 1 suppliers. Those are the ones you buy directly from. And then you have the sub-tier suppliers. So basically all the way down to the source, right? So again, if you're buying, let's say, textiles, cotton might be a ingredient in those textiles. And you need to go all the way back to the cotton manufacturer to find out how was that farmed? Did anything happen there? That's your full supply chain. So the CSRD, you need to describe that, of course. It does go in and specify that you need to have processes in place for managing your full supply chain. Also, to some extent, need to do materiality assessment for your full supply chain. But it's still a little bit vague in that area, to be honest. And it's both arguing for and against. Reality is you will have responsibility for your full supply chain, but it's also really, really difficult, and regulators know that. And there's no real golden bullet out there today. A lot of solution providers try to help you track the full supply chain. We do as well at Responsibly. But honestly, I'll just kind of say from a humility point of view that it is just difficult to get your hands on data from suppliers that are 5 tiers away. So anyways, you need to describe the supply chain. That's step number 2 here. Then there's a lot of commentary and descriptions you need to provide on your own processes. So step number 3 here is you need to describe how you integrate sustainability in your value chain practices. They call this, I think I have it on a slide later. I think they call it IPO or something like that. Let's have a look and see. Oh yeah, they call it PAT, policies, actions, and targets. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Basically, you need to describe, a lot of the processes, the policies you have in place, the actions you're taking, whatever targets you might have in place, and so on. And they give examples like this could be you have supplier selection criteria on those topics that are material. You're collaborating with suppliers, you're conducting audits, you're conducting trainings, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you just need to integrate sustainable procurement practices in your own processes, and then you need to describe them to the CSRD, and we'll get a little bit more in detail on this later. But you don't need to disclose anything on them, right? So it's more about describing what type of process you have rather than actually disclosing concrete metrics on it. CSRD is going to be the one where you need to start going a lot deeper on metrics as well. Again, we'll deep dive on it in a little bit. Step number 4 here is that you need to disclose procured materials when those substances are concerning. We'll have a deep dive slide up on it in a little bit, but basically it's like if you are procuring certain substances that are being flagged as a substance of concern, then you need to disclose the volumes that you're procuring of those. And those would be like things like substances that are extremely polluting, for example. Step number 5 is that there are some quantitative and qualitative data points in the value chain that you need to disclose on. I'll pull those up in a little bit as well. Some of it is related to emissions, and then there's some other topics there as well. So this is where you need to be a little bit more concrete and not just kind of describe your policies, actions, and targets. So that's what all companies need to do. Then there's something that specific companies need to do, and that's basically one saying, hey, when you identify a topic being material, you need to go a little bit deeper into that topic and describe, what you're doing about it. And they are extremely vague here, right? They're giving examples like, for example, you could disclose things like percentage workers in high-risk areas that are covered by social security schemes. You could disclose things like, reduction in health and safety incidents, supplier environmental impact data, and these kind of things. So they are deliberately being quite vague here. But basically, the whole principle is, find out what's going on. And then, when you have serious violations or serious topics, disclose that and start kind of tracking that a little bit more detailed. The last 2 here is pending the sector-specific guidance. I'll just show you very quickly what you can find in the IFRS that you can use as inspiration, because we'll probably see EFRAG and CSRD leaning against kind of existing standards there. But there might be some sector-specific disclosures, again, KPIs, that if you operate in certain sectors, you need to disclose. And then there might be some processes that you need to describe as well. And that's it. That's really the CSRD. I'll deep dive on some of these topics now. Remember, you can comment and ask questions. I think I have like a 10 or 15 seconds delay from when you see that to when it's being recorded. I saw Nikhil's comment here already. Great to hear, Nikhil. So seriously, just kind of ask questions along the way so we can have a conversation here. Awesome. When we talk about materiality assessment, we are really talking about the full scope of sustainability. So, if you're just looking at this on your mobile phone, probably this text is going to be very, very small. If you're looking on a computer, you can kind of go full size screen here if you want to. Basically, every one of the standards, E1, climate change, E2, pollution, water and marine resources, biodiversity and ecosystems, etc., have topics behind them. What we've done here is that we've just mapped it against the topic in Responsibly, because that's kind of the documentations we've created. But it gives you a little bit of an idea of which topics do you actually need to understand, whether or not they are material in your supply chain. You see that there's a lot of topics around emissions. There's a lot of topics around pollution. There's some around basically water consumption, water management, and marine. There's something around biodiversity. You'll have something around basically resource use, circularity, so recycling, product end of use, those kind of things. Then there's a big part around workers in the value chain. Now, a common misunderstanding about the CSRD is that this is the only thing you need to do in your supply chain because it's called workers in the value chain. So it's very easy to skim read the CSRD and just say, okay, we have a lot of kind of third-party labor things that we need to start reporting on. That's not true. You do need to conduct a materiality analysis across all of these topics for your value chain. There's something around local communities, consumers. There's a little bit of kind of governance in there as well, like corruption and so on. So these are basically the topics that you need to include in your materiality assessment. Again, the biggest effort here is going to be looking at the geographies and the industries you procure from and understand which topics are at risk just based on that footprint. And then you can go deeper, right? You can go deeper in the due diligence. You can start monitoring whether negative violations have occurred with any of your suppliers in any of these topics. You can also do the outside-in due diligence to see where those hotspots may have been mitigated. And then, of course, you can start doing supplier engagement. But again, you need to be really careful about the burden you put on your suppliers. So that's the materiality analysis. When we talk about describing the value chain practices, the CSRD is a little bit funny. It has this one section where it talks about when you find a topic to be material, you need to disclose always whether and how your policies, actions, or targets cover the value chain. And that would be the big section around workers in the value chain. It would be the section around affected communities, and it would be the section about consumers. So whenever you find this as being material in your value chain based on the analysis before, you need to describe and disclose your policies, action, and targets. And this can be things like, implementing procurement policies, supply code of conducts, trainings, actions you're taking with your suppliers. It could be things like including it in your contractual clauses, making sure that they're not allowed to violate on any of these areas. It could be things like selecting a smaller batch of suppliers and conducting audits on it. It could be things like having it as part of the selection criteria when you are procuring new suppliers, making sure that you cover these topics. Grievance mechanisms is being talked about. So that's essentially whistleblower systems, making sure that, the suppliers or people can anonymously report when things are going on in your supply chain, setting targets together with them, and so on. So there's a lot of examples in the CSRD of what you can do, and there's less like very concretely, this is what you have to do all the time, right? I think the main point here is that, when you've done your materiality analysis, when you've disclosed it, you need to start describing what you're doing about those material topics. The reason I said the CSRD is being a little bit funny is that they then said, okay, when you find any of these topics, which are more the environmental topics, as being material, you need to reflect on whether they are material and disclose the policies, actions, and targets that cover the value chain. So this is a little bit more vague in the guidance, right? It's more about you kind of reflecting on whether these topics are actual material and then disclosing whether or not they are and what you're doing about it. So whereas you here need to always disclose, here it's more about having the internal discussion and reflections to see whether you need to disclose the actions that you're taking. And now it gets super boring because now we get very, very detailed. So I'm not going to go over this to a very high degree, but I just wanted to give you some examples on each of the other topics. So when you need to disclose procured materials, it's mainly relating to pollution and resource use. So essentially, disclosing substances of concern. The CSRD has a big list of what is identified as substance of concern, and they need to disclose it when that happens. And then two, you need to some extent disclose you need to disclose your resource outflows. Now, whenever you buy something that's part of your resource outflows, you may need to disclose them, right? So for example, let's say that you are shipping consumer products. That's your outflow. So that's kind of your internal things you're producing, you're shipping out. You might be buying things that are included in that. So let's say you're buying packaging and you're just putting stuff in it. Then you may need to be disclosing things about packaging as well, right? And that means that, there might be topics like repairability, recyclability, and waste that comes up from a resource use and circularity perspective. So again, this part is very focused on what you are shipping out to the world. But since some of the stuff you procure ends up in what you're shipping out to the world, then it may impact your disclosures on repairability, recyclability, and waste management. Then there's some quantitative data you need to disclose. Part of this is around emissions, right? So you need to calculate and disclose your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. As you probably know, scope 3 emissions is largely around your value chain, especially category 1, which is purchased goods and services. And what the CSRD basically says is that you ideally need to include supplier-specific data there. And you can also disclose things like the percentage of your scope 3 that has been calculated with primary data, i.e. supplier-specific data. So since these basically measures will include information from your supply chain, there are actions that needs to be taken on your supply chain as well. There are also things like GHG removal products that you need to disclose when they happen in your supply chain. If we then go to qualitative data that needs to be disclosed, this is a little bit broader. So that was all of the quantitative data, by the way, right? So the quantitative metrics are very much related to emissions. If we go to kind of the qualitative metrics that needs to be disclosed, then it's a little bit broader. So one is around, your transition plan. So how does your transition plan for climate change mitigation, how does that include your value chain and your suppliers? Again, it's a lot of descriptions that needs to be done here. Some of it is related to biodiversity. So you need to describe how, impacts are identified and assessed in the value chain. You need to identify how resilient your value chain is to biodiversity. So this again comes back to some of the topics we had before here, where we're talking about, you identify something as being material, what are then your policies, actions, and targets to basically achieve those. Good. Lastly, qualitative wise, there's also some targets, how are you managing biodiversity? And also some qualitative descriptions around resource inflows along the supply chain. So basically describing, again, what is it that comes into to your own processes and goods from the supply chain. And that was really it. The last thing I'll just do is that if you look at the IFRS, these 14 industries have sector specific guidelines that addresses the value chain. So the IFRS is the most complete body out there that has sector-specific guidelines that the CSRD refers to. GRI has it as well. It goes a little bit deeper, but it's only released for some standards. Here, I just wanted to provide you the overview that if you find yourself in one of these 14 industries, have a look at IFRS guidelines because there will be specific disclosures on the value chain in there as well. And it's very likely that the CSRD specific guidelines will be having a look at these. So that should be a good indication of some sector specific guidelines that might come your way. And by the way, these are the 54 industries that do not have value chain specific guidelines from the IFRS. So you see that it is the majority that doesn't have it. There are a few that does have it. If you find yourself in one of these, reach out, have a look at IFRS, and we can tell you, or you can see what those specific guidelines are. And that's really it. I'll stay on for a few more minutes just to monitor the comments to see if any questions comes up. Otherwise, I hope this has been super helpful. So, do leave me a note or comment or send me a message if you thought this was helpful. If you want us to address similar topics in an informal session, similar to today in the future, then we'll do that. And yeah, if any questions pop up, let me know and I'll try to address them in the next few minutes. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening in. Awesome. Thank you so much, Rudi. I appreciate that. I'll share the slides with you guys directly. I just need a email. So send me a direct message and I'll send you guys an email with the slides. Thank you so much, Daryl. Thank you, Andrew and Nikhil. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Myrene. I am not seeing any questions coming in, which is totally fine. Thank you so much, Elisa. Again, reach out if you want the materials. Very happy to share them. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you guys for today, and I'll end the live stream. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.